reason why we're sort of in this corner is not because we're going to have a performance here. Now that we've got that performance out of the way, we start with our other performances. When we were at the session yesterday, actually in Sandip's session, we talked about Bengalis, and word came up that Kolkata, Bengalis are the only people who divide the world into Bengalis and Obali, or non-Bengali, and the weirdness of all of that. And in my case, as someone who grew up in Kolkata, you take it for granted as Kolkata is a Bengali city, and people, your friends say, Kolkata, that means whatever, Bengali, Rosgula, this and that. But it was when I went abroad, and people talked about Kolkata, that you suddenly realized there was a lot more to Kolkata than just being a Bengali city. About it, because people would remember things. People would say, I used to go to Newmarket, and I went to the Jewish bakery there. Or people would suddenly talk about, did you ever see the Armenian Church or something? Or people would miss Kolkata Chinese food. And you suddenly realize that this Kolkata has a lot of stuff in it which is beyond the stereotype. So in your case, as someone who grew up in the Jewish community in Kolkata, was diversity in Kolkata something you took for granted? Or was it something you later came to understand and appreciate?
I grew up in the 50s and 60s. I was born in 1955, left in 1971, and I was in a convent school, and I had a class of 42 children, girls, and we were from all communities. We had Chinese, we had people from Czechoslovakia, from the Barter Shoe Company, we had Jewish girls from India, we had Iranians, we had Chinese community, there were Parsi girls. So for me, I always thought Calcutta was very diverse. I never thought of myself as not belonging to the city. My father's family came in 1790 from Aleppo, from Syria. My mother's family is about 4 generations in India. And I grew up thinking I was Indian. So I was quite taken aback, actually first time in the States, when somebody questioned my being Indian, because I had never understood that before. And she said, but you're not Indian, you're Jewish. I said, what does that mean? I'm Indian. And my brother said the same thing. He went to a Jewish school in Brandeis, and he said that was the first time he said everybody there thought he was an Indian, and he was Indian Jew, which was different from everybody else, So we grew up with diversity as part of our lives. It was not only in who we met, not only in the communities in which we lived, but also in the food we ate. We had Jewish food, we had Anglo-Indian food, we had Bengali food, we had Guju food. Everything was like our cuisine. So we were very lucky because we felt that we actually were so enriched by the diversity of the city. So for me, over a period of time, I've been a little bit sad to see that there are not as many different communities left, as numbers of people have certainly dwindled. In my community, there are less than 20. We used to have about 4,000 Jews in Calcutta. The Armenians debating how many they have because they are worried about who is considered, who isn't considered an Armenian. The Chinese school has closed. They don't feel they have enough Chinese children. So I think there's a little bit of a loss for the city, but I also feel that the people of Calcutta are not just about Bengalis and non-Bengalis, because I think there's also their pride in that heritage by Bengalis. And I think Bengalis, because of the diversity which is part of their lives, they're quite different from other people across India because they're accepted. I don't even think accept, I think there's an embrace of diversity. At least that's how I felt.
Do you feel though that the diversity, idea of diversity and how Bengalis treated is also kind of skewed? So when people talk about Kolkata and its diversity, they're constantly talking about the Chinese of Kolkata, the Jews of Kolkata. Every 2 years someone will do an article on the last Jews of Kolkata and stuff. But when people talk about the diversity of Kolkata, very rarely do people talk about Marwadis, for a huge part of the city. But they don't. You don't get big picture stories about Marwadis coming up.
They own the city, so I think they own a lot of the city. But I think forget Marwadis, because I think Marwadis have a lot of clout in the city. In fact, a lot of Jewish businesses sold out to Marwadis. I think it's the other communities, the Marwadis, the Biharis, the South Indians, and many other communities who see Calcutta as their home. I mean, they've all been there for long periods of time. So I think, yeah, I think maybe there's some kind of exotica now associated with Jews, Parsis, Armenians, and Chinese. But I think that's because there's so few less that people think we're an extinct species, but we're not. We've just relocated. And what's really exciting for me, and this notion of home, and what means it's coming home, is that Jews from my community who are all over the world live in London as though in Calcutta, okay? For them, Calcutta is very much home. Their children, their grandchildren, they keep coming back. They're like a revolving circle, you know? They come and they go to all the places they know and familiar. So I think for the Chinese too, I attended Chinese weddings and Chinese Dragon Festival. It's the only one that they still do. And then Chinese from abroad come to the city they meet other Chinese, you know, from all the different parts of the world, and they do marriage arrangements during those Chinese Dragon Festivals and things like that. Then they want to marry another Chinese from India, even though they may have settled in Toronto or they may have settled in Australia. So I think that Anglo-Indians do the same. I went to the Bow Barracks Festival for Christmas, and there have been so many Anglo-Indians who don't live in Calcutta, who have come home because they want to meet other Anglo-Indians from Calcutta. So they have that nostalgia too. So I think whether Calcutta accepts it or not, it is the home of many, many communities. Communities who come from outside, communities from within India. Bengalis may not think that it's their home, but they think it's their home.
No, that's absolutely true, because I actually went to the Marudha Utsav once, and the young Marwari guy said, for me, you know, as a third generation person, Indore or this place in Rajasthan, or some place in Rajasthan, Shekhawat, where the family goes, that's not home, that's like an exotic vacation for me. Home for me has been Bazaar. We don't live in Bazaar anymore, but that's where my grandmother used to live. And so that is the idea of home. But it's also interesting, just before this session, I got on a news list that I'm on, a thing from the Marwari Sammelan, saying they're holding a press conference this Monday to protest about the fact that they feel like they have been in the city for so long, but they don't, and I mean, they're not saying that they own the city, but they feel that they don't have political power proportionate to the kind of influence and time and money that they have invested in the city. And so with the elections coming up, they're having a press conference. I mean, there are many complicated reasons as to why that is so. But I also wanted to talk about this book. So, you know, you say you were felt lucky that you were growing up with so much diversity that you kind of took for granted. You know, it's not like in the West where you have a diversity officer who is trying to promote diversity within the organization. This was much more natural. So from that general diversity, why did you start in this book looking at the diversity of places of worship? Because I imagine that even if you took for granted the food and all that was coming in, you probably hadn't gone to many of these temples or churches that are in this book.
So he's talking about this book that actually is not done by me alone. It's done by, actually it was her idea, Mala Mukherjee, who's a wonderful photographer, and you'll actually see her slides today. I'm so sorry she can't be with us. So she had asked me, I have these wonderful photographs I'm going to take, will you do the lighting about the various communities that lived in Calcutta? So it's a joint project. And actually for me it was a particularly interesting project because of course she's a wonderful photographer, but I think especially today when we want to talk about India and a Hindu India and the nation sort of reimagined, I want people to remember that this nation is what it is today because of the many communities who play the role. So this book is not really telling the stories about what a church looks like, but tries to bring to light the story of those various communities who made that sacred place. I also think that Calcutta is very unusual because in the 18th and 19th century, very few big cities in the world had this kind of diversity of religions because we were second to London. Because we were a port city, there were Armenians, there were Greeks, there were Jews, there were Chinese, there were Parsis, there was European Jews, others from many, many parts of India who all came to the city, Japanese, Buddhists, Muslims of course. So we had, and different types of Muslims. So we had the kind of diversity and the kind of fabulous religious structures and edifices in place in the 18th and 19th century, which I think are very unique because they were built on a grand scale. because indeed Calcutta was a very grand city and still is, and that building tradition has continued. We're continuing to see vast religious places made. So I think in terms of Calcutta's sacred geography has really been not promoted as much as it should. And I think as part of our heritage, these sacred places, if we value them and know what they are, actually it's going to be very important for the city, because I think it brings in a lot of tourists. For example, for me alone, and we'll talk about it later, my work on the Jewish community, people who are going to Bombay, and the Kochini Jews are very well known, people go in flocks to see the Paradesi synagogue. People didn't even know that the largest synagogue in Asia is in Calcutta. Okay, and our synagogues are truly quite magnificent. Even though I'm Jewish, I'm saying that, but we have, you can attest to it, they're quite wonderful. And European Jews, Jews from other parts of the world, they used to come on religious tours, and they used to go to Bombay, and they used to go to Cochin. But the last 4 years, they actually know about it, and we have so many of them coming, staying as high-end tourists, the Grand Hotel, the Lalit Hotel, because it's close to the synagogues, coming in groups of 20, 30, and 40. And they spend 10 days in India. I think it's a bit limited, going to look at India's Jewish heritage, because they're Jews and they want to pray in all the various synagogues. And we have such a variety and diversity of Jews in India as well. In fact, we didn't know much about each other's traditions, but they're very different. The Bene Israel from Bombay is very different from the Kochini Jews, which are very different from the black Jews of Cochin, to the white Jews of Cochin, and then with the Baghdadis. So for them, that's pretty fascinating. So I think we can, as the Jewish community can bring in that kind of tourists, I think all these communities can, and then think of us, if we put it all together, what a wonderful mosaic we have to share with the world. We're just going to run through some of the places, not all of them, that are depicted in the book, and I'm going to stop in a couple of places and just read a tiny bit so you have a sense of what the book sounds like. Most of those places, but just running through them, they're pretty unique in themselves. I don't know if you know much about the Greek community. I first heard about them before I saw their church, because their cemetery is right next to our Jewish cemetery in Nakildanga. People know about St. John's Church. It's an amazing sort of memorial to colonialism, because in St. John's Church, everything for the church was looted, okay, and built by the British, but on Indian spoils. And so each of these have a really unique story to tell, but since we don't have time, I'm just going to leave to you the Armenian Church. The large heavy gates of the Holy Church of Nazareth open from Old China Bazaar Street into a large, open and rather stark compound filled with closely set and inscribed tombstones. It used to be the burial ground of the Armenian community, and it has the grave of Raziba D, dated 1630. Her grave is believed to be the earliest Christian grave in Calcutta. Aga Jacob Nazar built the Holy Church of Nazareth in 1724 on the graveyard. It is the earliest Christian church in Calcutta, and its adjacent areas are considered the mother church of Armenians in India. An architect from Iran, Gabon, designed the church. Over the years, several modifications were made to include the building of a clock tower in 1734, and in 1790, the interior was decorated and houses for the clergy were erected. The Armenians were known as the merchant princes of India. They had established good connections with the Mughal emperors. While the Armenian community of Calcutta has now dwindled precipitously, they still hold an elaborate Christmas Mass, the Divine Liturgy, on January 6th each year. It is the date they consider as the original birthday of Jesus. The Divine Liturgy is ornate and colorful. Before the morning service begins, priests in flowing white robes embellish the altar, already rich with color and symbolism. Upon the altar stands a large Coptic cross, the gospel text, and 12 candlesticks to symbolize the 12 apostles. 3 large paintings, the Holy Trinity, the Last Supper, and the enshrouding of our Lord, frame the altar. Icons and other items of religious significance are brought out from the vaults of the church and placed on the altar for this holy occasion. Many white candles are lit and flowers are placed on the altar to make it an even more magnificent backdrop for the service that unfolds. When the preparations are completed, the chief priest makes his way to the altar to conduct the prayer service. He cuts an impressive figure, and he is dressed in a white flowing robe adorned with red and gold religious symbols. He wears a tall red velvet and gold crown. The service is conducted in Armenian. Young boys and girls from Armenia who receive full support to study at the Armenian school in Calcutta add their voices to give more splendor to this occasion. The young boys wear flowing blue and white vestments. They stand behind the chief priest and the assistant and serve as a chorus. Young girls wear long white and orange trimmed robes. They sing from the balcony upstairs at the opposite end that hangs over the church. To end the elaborate and ancient service, the chief priest proceeds down the nave, dispensing incense, blessing and speaking with the congregants, who stands as he passes. The choir boys carry large crosses, follow him as he slowly makes his way down the aisle. This grand ceremonial procession is a magnificent ending to an intricately choreographed service. Church. This is a lovely church. There were 9 Chinese churches in Calcutta, now there's 7. The first Chinese settlement in Calcutta, according to the British archival records, occurred in the 1780s. Governor General Warren Hastings granted Chinese trader Tong Achu 650 acres of land south of Baj to set up a sugarcane plantation and factory at an annual rate of Rs 45. He bought a band of Chinese workers to work in his enterprise. Achu died shortly thereafter, and the workers moved to Calcutta. After the Treaty of Nanjing in 1842 secured British entry to the opium trade and further territorial expansion, impoverished Chinese migrated to colonial Calcutta and set themselves up in numerous trades. For example, those from Guangdong province and some from Shanghai were working in the dockyards and other odd jobs. By the early 20th century, the Hakkas were mostly engaged in the leather business, and the Cantonese were in carpentry and ran restaurants. A few started working in the tea gardens. The number of Chinese inhabitants peaked around World War II, when there were Chinese barbers, tailors, hairdressers, and a few goldsmiths. There's still one Chinese jeweler who works in gold in Calcutta, but his eyes are going, and Dominic is not able to do that very fine work anymore. The various Chinese communities established their own social clubs. Each club controlled a temple or church and a burial ground. The Chinese temples in Calcutta are traditional Buddhist, Taoist Chinese temples. There are 7 temples today. Members of the Chinese community believe that Namsun Church to have been built during the reign of the Guangxu Emperor in 1875 to 1908. A small gate off a narrow winding street leads to a large, serene front courtyard with a few ornamental trees. Inside, the main worship hall's the principal deity. Wandi is worshipped along with her war companions who flank her statue. The inscription hanging above the altar reads, "Prosper in foreign lands." The large shrine room, resplendent with red and gold artifacts, has a set of ceremonial religious weapons on display. A very large red ceremonial drum hangs in the hall. A grand, intricately carved sailing vessel hangs from the ceiling. Many of the carved and painted wooden temple items were imported from China and donated by founding members. Besides the shrine rooms in the hall where members of the association would gather for meetings, the communal school for Chinese medium is located at the back of the premises. After the brief Indo-Sino War, thousands of Indian nationals of Chinese descent were interned in the desert camps of Deoli in Rajasthan, where they were held for years without trial. Families were torn apart and were traumatized by this very brutal act. When the internees returned, they found their property sold or looted. During those years of panic and insecurity for Indians of Chinese descent, many of their documents were destroyed, including documents containing the history of the community and churches. Many Indians of Chinese descent were thereafter deported. This led to an exodus of Chinese from Calcutta and other parts of India to the west. A significant proportion of Chinese from Calcutta emigrated to Canada, where they have prospered. The Calcutta Chinese community is very vibrant in Canada and boasts 4 Hakka clubs. Meanwhile, the community of Calcutta has dwindled to less than 1,500 members. Okay, so now we'll finish the slideshow. Maybe 100 photos in the book, but that just gives you some selection. We don't cover all the various communities, but you'll get a sense of the diversity and the beauty of some of these buildings.
So if you have questions about any of these particular slides, please remember them to ask. Or you can ask now. Does anyone have a question right now about any of the slides we saw?
Actually,
yeah,
I do. Yeah, I just want to know. It is heard that there are people buried in the sitting position in the Armenian Church. Is that true?
Look at me, I'm not
I don't think so, because actually the graves, so they're all very, very flat.
Okay.
But what is very strange is to get to the church, you have to walk over graves. You can't even go around them. And I thought that was very unusual. But when I went to the one near Murshidabad, that was the same situation. I'm not sure why they built over gravestones. I don't think that's typical in other parts of the world, but that's interesting. It's a beautiful church. I chose to describe this service because I went for it on January 6th, and I'd encourage any of you, if you're in Calcutta on January 6th, to take the time. I don't know how much longer it will be that they'll have. Like my synagogues, we don't have any services. They stopped. The last wedding was in 1982. We need 10 men for a service, and now it's kind of pathetic because we only have services when foreigners come and they have a service because we have 10 men. And their liturgy and their traditions are quite different from ours. But luckily there's one girl who's about my age, Jael Silliman, whose father was a rabbi, who's 93 right now, and has done wonderful work on our community. She brings a group back twice a year of about 30 foreigners, and she conducts, in our music and our songs and everything else. But really it's like a performance, because the synagogue is not really a place of worship anymore. It's more a place that people come to see. And some people think that's sad, but I'm really happy that the synagogues are still there, because in the 1960s, this is a very grand synagogue, the one you saw, the Magen David, there was no Jewish people enough to have services. And we are a wealthy community, and we do have quite a lot of trust funds, and it got into somebody's heads in Israel that they wanted to worship in the Magen David in Jerusalem. Okay? Now what they did is they went to talk to the mayor, Teddy Kollek at the time, and he said, but we can, if you all have money, you can bring the synagogue to Jerusalem. Like you brought your Sefer Torahs and your wonderful scrolls. We have hundreds of them which have gone to Baghdadi synagogues around the world. And these Jews said, yeah, we will pay for it brick by brick to be lifted, and we'll put it in Jerusalem. And the negotiation was going forward. And people in Calcutta, the few Jews left, got wind of it. And if you have 2 Jews, you have 3 arguments. So, of course, they immediately started 3 arguments. That's true. So they argued among each other, and immediately they registered with the ASI. So it couldn't be moved. And I'm really happy in one way that it wasn't moved, because I think that these physical structures are testimony that we actually lived here. But at the same time, I also understand why Jews who miss their synagogue and feel that it's not a place where people pray anymore, it's a deserted space, also want it there. So of course there are 2 sides to every argument, but I think we need to keep restoring, and we do a good job actually, our community, restoring these spaces. And I know most of the other communities do that themselves too. We don't get help from the ASI to do so.
So now we, talking so much about the synagogues, people are coming and about restoring them and all of that. But when you were a kid growing up, and then Jews are already starting to leave India, but there were services still. So as a kid, now did you actually enjoy going to the synagogues regularly?
I was never a regular synagogue goer because a good Jew actually goes to the synagogue every Sabbath. So my grandmother did that. But I loved going for the high holidays because we really did have a lot of fun on the high holidays. And it was a time where we had 3 synagogues still going, and they were all next to each other. And I'll never forget, and I met somebody recently, I was giving a talk in Israel, and I met one of the boys after 50 years. There was a family that had come during the time of when the Burmese problem was going on, and people trekked over from Burma. We had a big community of our Jews in Rangoon, and they also trekked through. And Mr. Meyer came, and he came with, which is quite a sensation for us, he came with 2 Burmese wives. And the law of Jewish law is that you're allowed to take on the traditions of the country you live in, so he said it's kosher for him to have 2 Burmese wives. So not only did he have two Burmese wives, he had 15 children. Okay.
By those 2 or by others?
No, those two. Those 2. And there were 15 children, the Maya kids. And the Maya kids filled our synagogue with all kinds of fun and games. And so we always looked forward to playing there with them, meeting them in the synagogue, running around, because it's a large space. And the synagogue's not very formal like a church where people sing and, lovely choir and orchestra and organ. So my father always said, the Jewish synagogue, it's sort of like everybody's doing their own number, everybody's relaxed, everybody's having a good time. It's not very formal. So I said, why is that? He said, because, Christians have to be very formal because they're in God's house. But this is our Father's house. It's okay. We can just relax and have a good time. So the synagogue was not a very formal place. The women sat upstairs because they're conservative Jews, the men downstairs, but the children could run up, back and forward and have a good time. So actually the synagogue was a fun place on high holidays. I didn't like going on for the weekly services, and that I avoided and have since.
When we see a lot of these pictures, one of the problems is often that it gets viewed through a very nostalgic lens. This was Calcutta, then, now, everything. But when you are working on, sort of say, your archival of the Jewish history of Calcutta, is it really a matter of nostalgia, which Bengalis are often accused of indulging in too much? Or do you think there's actually something very contemporary and important about doing this archival at this point in our country's history?
I actually have been encouraging the Parsi community members I know and Armenians to do the same kind of work. I don't know so many in the other communities. It's a lot of work. I've not done this work by myself. I've worked with about 14 students from Jadavpur University over 6 or 7 years, with help, from School of Culture, Religion and Cultural Texts, Dr. Amlan Gupta, so that's been very helpful. But I think it's very important to tell this story again, especially today, because it's easy to forget the minority communities, because we don't have a kind of presence today, but we did really make a significant impact on the politics and the culture of Kolkata. When I grew up in the 50s or 60s, there were texts about our community, and we were a community of, I thought, landlords and landowners and business, and my father's family opened the stock exchange, and it was all kind of boring stuff. I was not really interested or excited by any of it. But when I started the archive, because I'm a woman, and because my lens is also different from some of the male histories that write about sort of the guys of the community. In fact, I've written a book about 4 generations of women in my family, and my mother came from a very normal middle-class family. My father came from a wealthy family, first ones to come. And I said, Dad, I'm writing a book about our family. And he said, great, I can tell you all about my grandfather and great-grandfather. I said, I really don't want to know, because I'm writing about Mom's family. He said, really? Is there anything to write about? So, there's that kind of sexism that was very strong, at least in my father's generation. But when I started writing, doing the work for the archive, I actually realized that a lot of India's history cannot be told without telling our history as well. From very simple things, the first woman to argue in the courts for women to be lawyers was a Jewish woman in 1914. She didn't win her case, It was won later by a Parsi woman. The first women actresses in India, in the Hindi and Bengali and silent film, some of them were Jewish because Indian women weren't allowed to be on the stage. The first production company, film production company owned by a woman was a Jewish woman. There were teachers, there were lawyers, they were the first in many of the professions. First dentists, some of the first doctors, like along with other important women, but they were shapers. I looked at photographers, for example, and David Mordecai, was apparently really important for setting up commercial photography in the city of Calcutta. I wrote about this magician who I'd never heard of. He's recorded as an Englishman, but actually his first cousin told me that he was Jewish, and this guy was such a great magician. He's known all over the world, Eddie Joseph. In Bombay, there's a ring, the Eddie Joseph ring, named after him. 70 books of magic. Considered a man who made a trick a day. One of the greatest magicians known all over the world. So from magicians to film stars to real estate people to... we didn't have artists, unfortunately. I don't know, I didn't find any painters. But they really shaped the history. Jerry Judah? Yeah, we have now. So I've looked at now our Jewish community members also gone back to diaspora and come back and included them too. And there's a very famous British artist who considers himself a British Indian artist, Jerry Judah, and I'd love you to see his work online. So yeah, I think it's very important to tell this story because I think if you don't tell the story of minority communities, you have a very truncated history of our city, a truncated history of the country as well. And I think that now more than ever, why I do these books right now, it's partly also political. I think we have to remind people, unfortunately, that India is great because of all the people who contributed to its greatness. And I think that's an important story to tell.
Well, you said it was, you encouraging the Parsi, the Armenians to do similar projects. It's a lot of work. So in your case, when you started doing a digital archive of Jewish history, how did you even, what advice would you have to someone who wanted to start? It's like, how do you plunge into it? How difficult was it to get access to these materials? As you mentioned, you didn't even know about that this magician was Jewish. What was that process of discovery like for you?
So what was really interesting for me is I didn't get any materials, almost zero, from Calcutta. I could only look at the physical spaces in Calcutta and document and film them. I actually had to rely on personal family stories, documents, essays, memories, photographs. And in the days of internet, even these 80 and 90-year-olds, they know how to scan and send their information. Their children don't know the history anymore. So once this generation goes, that history would have been lost forever. So I also felt under some kind of pressure to capture the memories and the stories and the photographs of people who between the ages of 70 and 90. And what was amazing to me is how interested they were. They love Calcutta. So you talk to them about the Calcutta project, they're all there. They really wanted to send stuff. And they sent stuff. They wanted to edit stuff. They would even say, you've forgotten a colon, you've forgotten a comma. When I put it together, they wanted to read every single word and make sure it's right. So that was a good part of it. I could not have done it without my mother. My mother's 89, and it was her network of friends that I tapped in, who then contacted their network of friends. And this information came primarily from USA, Canada, Australia, some from Israel, and lots from London. So those were the 5 countries. So it's actually multi-country as well. So it's not an easy job, but I think they have the finances. It's not an expensive job. You just need somebody with commitment to gather the information, and these days with information sent so quickly. So far in the archive, I have recipes, I have music, I have photographs, I have documents, I have wedding photos, I have our wedding contracts and ketubas. It would probably take a week to 10 days to go through this archive. It's pretty significant, it's pretty big. I have some on women pioneers, schools, community institutions. What's really sad is we've lost most of our documents. When Jewish businesses sold out in the 50s, we don't know where the documents went. So I have not enough documentation, which are documents that I have, but I don't think they're very available. So I think the Parsis, I hope they've kept their records better. I hope the Armenians too. As I told you, the Chinese couldn't even give me the date of their church because they said when they were interned, a lot of their documents were destroyed. So different communities may have different problems, but it's a very doable project. And I got a lot of help from people over here who are very excited about the project too.
You mentioned the Chinese. I remember a few years ago actually, several people who had been originally interned in those camps came to Kolkata on a visit. And for some of them, they now lived in USA and Canada, and for some of them, it was their first visit back to India since they left after 1962, 1964. And when you were talking about Kolkata as the home, people consider it as the home, this man I talked to said that he was so, he said, I was a kid then, and the war, right before the war on Independence Day, I was marching down the streets of Chalpaiguri or Kalimpong, wherever he left, waving an Indian flag, as part of the school procession. Then the war breaks out, and my family is suddenly called Chinese, and we are packed into a train, sent to Rajasthan, and I'm suddenly not Indian anymore. The war lasts 3 weeks. We are kept in the camp for 3 to 4 years. And you just figure people just forgot about us. And then you came back and, then you have to apply for, even to this day, I think Chinese have to apply for, who were born in that particular time period, have to apply for a renewal of permit to stay in the country. And when they came back, they were not allowed to go much beyond, somebody came to meet them at Howrah Station, at one of the other former internees, and was promptly arrested because he had gone out of the area he was supposed to be in. So it's a very traumatic and painful history. And then he comes back and he says, the only thing I don't want any compensation. I just want acknowledgement from the Indian government that this happened. That we want to erect a memorial in Deoli saying this many Chinese were interned here. But India just sort of wants to pretend it didn't happen. And this man was in his 70s, he was very stoic. And he suddenly started talking about a memory of when he was a kid, they killed a bird with a slingshot because there wasn't very much food in the camp. And then he plucks it, and there was another girl that he liked who was there, and he just sort of gave that bird away to her, as a thing. And he said, I sometimes wonder what happened to her, where did she go? And he started weeping, the 70-year-old man sitting in Park Hotel, and because that memory was so strong. And he said that my parents' generation never talked about it because they just wanted to forget it. So, it's a complicated and layered story that we create. And I wanted to go to couple of audience questions. But before that, are there any particular objects that came out in your research that really talks about, when these Jews came to India, how India changed them? Because I remember we had several photographs, sort of before, after photographs of people who just arrived, and then a few years later, you could talk a little bit about it.
India completely shaped us. We were here almost 250 years. We were Arab Jews. We became Indian Jews, okay? We changed our food, we changed our dress, we changed our education systems, but we were also a people always on the move, We changed our music, we changed a lot of things. We are very much part of Indian society. People talk about Jews being very European and very westernized. My archive shows quite different. You see people sitting down in Gana Bajana sessions. You see them actually going to Bengali theatre, patrons of Bengali theatre. They were very comfortable in both languages. Many of the older Jews knew Arabic and Hindi or Bengali or Urdu. They didn't know English. Sir David Ezra, who was so well known in our community, couldn't sign his name in English. So yes, we became more anglicized, like the Bengalis as well, by the early 20th century. But I always like people to remember that we were Arab Jews, okay? And I think that's important, especially today. Arab Jews, okay? My granny spoke Arabic, okay? And she spoke Urdu, she spoke Hindi. They knew Urdu very well, because it was close to Persian, so they could manage in those languages. So they were very comfortable in the East. We had mostly very good relations with Muslims. We have the Muslims who look after our synagogues, 4 generations, because we grew up in Muslim lands. We came from Iraq and the Middle East, so we knew Muslim culture very well. We had similar kind of dietary laws and restrictions. So yes, we changed a lot in India. India changed us, and I think it was a diaspora of hope. Unlike the Europeans, Jews who were persecuted, we actually thrived in India. There was nothing that we were not able to do. My uncle stayed on in India. He became Major General in the army, Major General Jacob. He did extremely well. Anybody who stayed on, there was nothing that was close to them. So I think that was a wonderful experience, and it's very different. And I want to tell the Indian Jewish story, which is very different from the European Jewish story, because they were victims, okay? We were not victims, okay? Yes, the 800,000 Jews who had to leave the Arab lands when Israel was formed, they were victims. Okay, they lost everything when they went to Israel. They went to refugee camps. For a whole generation, they did very badly. But that was not the situation in India. And I think it's important for the world to know that there was one country in the world, and that is India, where anti-Semitism never took hold, except when the Portuguese came here. But I want to move away from Jews, because this is about multiple things. And I wanted to say about the trauma of the Chinese. But despite the trauma that the Chinese experience, I know a Chinese doctor and his wife, who's a nurse, who for the last 20 years have come home every year to India for over 2 weeks and work in tribal villages, Sundarbans, everywhere, bringing medicine, doing medical camps and everything else. And I think we need to know also the stories of these communities. I met the mayor from one of the small towns in Canada. He said, I want my town to have relationships with Calcutta. We want economics and trade with this, because this was my city. So I think the diaspora of all these minority communities around the world have been wonderful ambassadors for India, because when they speak about India, despite even the trauma that the Chinese faced, they speak of it with love, because it was a wonderful time. And I know the Jewish community, the Armenian community, they always say their best days were India, okay? And that love still lasts.
On that note, we can take a couple of questions. Yeah.
All the time now, I find, since these are the times, the kind of focus we've been putting on diversity and how each of our spaces have been so enriched by so many kinds of influences and people and cultures and religions and food and music and you name it. And sometimes I just wonder, what if there hasn't been, it's like we keep talking about the mosaic, and I think you also mentioned it. But you know, around each piece in a mosaic is a little white line. And I can't help wonder why, with thousands sometimes of years of people living close together in close proximity, doing trade, you know, the intermarriage has still, by and large, to my limited knowledge, has remained an exception. And it goes for all communities. I'm not talking about any one in particular. And I remember at a workshop somebody said, you know, we talk of a diversity in India, and it is absolutely true. But the two things that have been separate have been always roti and beti.
Yeah, well, for us, the Jewish community, it was really important that we didn't intermarry. We were 4,000 Jews, and the only way we could keep our religion alive, we thought, was by not intermarrying, because otherwise it was very easy to be lost in India. So we had very close friendships, we shared everything, but marriage used to be a taboo. So I always thought that there wasn't much intermarriage. I was intermarried before I got divorced, but at my father's generation there was. What I found in the archive was really truly striking. There was much more intermarriage than I thought. And I have lists and lists of people who intermarried. Muslims, Hindus, Christians, Anglo-Indians, Armenians. There was lots more, but you know what? Nobody wanted to talk about it. Those were the bad girls. Those were the ones who were out. It was just like the film stars. First Miss India and her daughter, only two to be Miss India 1947, 1967 Jews from Calcutta. One was Muslim, because she married out. She married a Muslim. Okay, nobody wanted to talk about these women, and because they were out, right? The Jewish men were wealthy, so they would convert the women. But if the women went out, they were lost, right? They didn't want to speak about them. But actually, when you do an archive, which is a community archive where you get the stories from multiple people and multiple voices, I saw much, much more intermarriage than we were ever told of officially. And I think that may be the case for other communities as well. I think there's both advantages and disadvantages for small communities when it comes to intermarriage. Because if we really intermarried a lot, there would have not been a Jewish community left in this city. So I think for small micro communities like ours, where you have 4,000 among 1 billion people, it's very hard if you open the floodgates to marry outside, to also maintain your own identity. But it's a complex question and argument, so we can talk about that later.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll speak to my
We
I live in Mumbai, and I've got friends. One is Mr. Victor Sassoon, who was the response director, Times of India. And his grandfather, David Sassoon, did like tons, as we all know him. And these people, like Victor today, he's gone to Israel. He's kind of left. So what we're talking about, there's a kind of an antithesis to the whole thing as well, which I've seen myself. I've got another friend called Nuriel Kazarkar, who's also been Israeli, and he's married to a Maharashtrian, Subarna. And he says that, man, if I wasn't married to her, I would have been back in Israel. So what is this shift in the paradigm that is kind of happening? Is it a reflection of the modern times, or is it?
You actually said two different things. First of all, those are two different communities. Victor Sassoons are my community, they're the Baghdadi Jews, and Bnei Israels have a much older lineage and heritage in Calcutta, in India, so in Mumbai area. They've been there for thousands of years, literally, and the Cochin Jews came next, okay? And now we have a new group of Jews as well from the northeast who've been recognized as Jews from Mizoram and Manipur. Okay, and now there's a group in Andhra who also said that they're Jews, they're Dalits who say they're Jews, okay? So we're working with that. So we're getting lots of people calling themselves Jews. But you're talking about these two. The Jews left in 1948 for a number of reasons. And I'm going to talk about the Sassoon family. Most of them actually didn't go to Israel. They went to London. There are a few Sassoons in Israel, but the ones who had money went to England, okay? They didn't go to Israel because Israel was very tough in those days. But there was actually a confluence of issues that happened in 1947-48 that led to the exodus of Jews, of Baghdadi Jews. One was India got its independence, and they came during the colonial period, and they were not sure what their futures would be like. Not only Jews, a lot of Indians also were offered they could go to London and settle over there, and Jews and lots of other people went as well. There had been quite a lot of European refugees in Calcutta and Bombay who had come during 1947, and they had done very well in Europe, but suddenly things changed with Hitler and Germany and everything else, and Jews were not sure, what if something like that happens to us? There was also the British forces that were here, and American forces, many of them were Jewish, and they married Jewish girls from our community, and they took them back to their various countries. Okay, already a community is very small, and people started moving. We had our relatives from Singapore, from Burma and Shanghai. We were a community that spread from Shanghai to Baghdad. Okay, they actually were also fleeing. They came to Calcutta. Even a few from Baghdad came to Calcutta. And the Burmese Jews were able to settle. America gave them refugee status in America. Many of them married their cousins in Calcutta, and they left over too. Then there was the partition riots going on in India, and very much in Calcutta. And that also was a big wake-up call for the Jews. They saw Hindus and Muslims murdering each other. They were not touched, but it was a frightening call, what was happening at the time. And then Australia opened up its White Australia policy. So there were so many global, national and international factors that led for some Jews to leave. But when some Jews were leaving, by the time I grew up in the 1960s, okay, there were 700 Jews left. It was not enough to sustain a community. From 4,000 to 700, it was hard to get kosher food, it was hard to carry on community. My father said, you must go abroad. I was like, oh no, I don't want to go. He said, no, because you have to marry a Jew and there's nobody here to marry. I was like, okay, whatever. I married a Bengali. It didn't quite work out the way he wanted. But they wanted you at least to have the opportunity to meet somebody from your own religion. So marriage became an issue. My brother had his bar mitzvah. Somebody had to fly in from abroad to do the circumcision. There was nobody in India. So things became hard. My granny was here for the longest time till she couldn't get the kosher food she needed anymore. So she left. So there are many reasons for communities to go. I think there are multiple. What you have right now, I was in Hong Kong recently for a talk, and in Singapore, the Baghdadi Jews had a lot of money. They had gone, but now European Jews, because Hong Kong has become a very important financial center, and because Singapore is a financial center, now a Jewish community, but a European Jewish community living on Sephardic Jewish money from that region, they're recreating a Jewish community in that area. And I think a little bit is beginning to happen like that in Bombay as well. If we become a metropole again, I think our synagogues will be full, because people from around the world, the Jews will come back. That's what I think. On that happy note.
I think we're going to have to end this session. Thank you very much. Thank you.
I have a couple of books where Reside, if anybody wants, and also I've got a couple of my novels, because I also like novels about the Jewish community. Can we thank Anjum and Shanta for having us here? It's been really, really an amazing weekend. So thank you so much for including me. Anjum, thank you so much for including me. This one, Where Gods Reside, is by Niyogi, and Joel Sharkar has done kindly the introduction for us. I have another book which is done by Seagull Press and printed abroad, which tells the story of 4 generations of women in my family. I didn't bring it, it's hardcover, so I didn't carry it. I've done one novel which I self-published, and another one by a small press called Milestone Books, and I have that one here. It's called Teak, Almirah. It's a story really about Jews coming home, looking for home in Calcutta. You have a Jew coming from Australia who wants to see the Calcutta community as it was 60 years ago, and he doesn't like anything he sees. And you have a young girl coming from London who's come open-minded and loves everything she sees, and you have a Jewish lady here as well, and the story unfolds to 3 very different views of the city.